Hi, so my name is Bridget Naughton, and today I'm going to speak a little bit about SQL pivots and what they are and show you how to do a pivot with a real life example. And on the next slide, before I dive a little bit into SQL pivots, it might be important to know that SQL pivots are almost exactly the same as Excel pivots in the way that they show the data. The only differentiating factor is how you get to the final table through the manipulation of the data. Essentially, what pivots are is they are the selection of a smaller portion of data from a larger data set to analyze more thoroughly. The pivot operator chooses a category of data from the larger data set and transforms it from rows into columns in the pivot. Under each column in the new pivot, you can select data you want to compare and turn these rows into aggregates utilizing the sum, min, max, average, or count functions. But overall, it's much easier to gain deeper insight on data in a pivot because you get to pick how you want to compare the data through the use of aggregates, but also but also the categories that you want to compare. Whereas if you're looking at a larger data set that's not a pivot, it might be harder to retain information or translate information because you're looking at large sums of data, could be hundreds of columns, whereas in the pivot, it might be more so like 2 or 3 columns. So in the next slide, I'm going to explain a little bit the difference between group by and pivot. If you're someone who's familiar with SQL, you're probably wondering what the difference is. As you can see in the group by statements on the left side, the category names are the column names. However, when we do the pivot on the right side, it transforms the rows under the driver names into the column names. This slide shows you visually the difference between the group by and the pivot. And as you can see under the 3 categories, or under the second row here, another important mention is that the first example compares just 2 categories, driver names and average driver charges. However, you can add more categories because in this example, we actually added the driver ID over here. So now I'm going to take you through the 3 easy steps of pivoting. But before I do that, it's really important to mention that before you pivot, or pivoting can only occur after completely successful migration of data into SQL and after you cleanse the data and joined it correctly, because you don't want to run pivots on information that might be lacking, because the invalid data will just confuse you within the pivot. So the first step to pivoting is that you're going to want to decide on what categories you would like to pivot. In this example, I chose to utilize the driver name and also the driver charge. So to get a visualization for this, you're going to run a select statement in SQL. You're selecting the driver name with the driver charge from the drivers table, and executing this, you're going to see the data that you're going to then pivot or utilize in step 2 as well. So steps 2 and 3 kind of combine off of each other since step 3 actually utilizes step 2. What you're going to do in step 2 is you're going to create a temporary result set. You're going to take that select statement that you just wrote in step 1. You're going to add parentheses around it with a select from in front of the parentheses in the first line, and you're going to add a T to denote that it's going to be a temporary data set. When you go to run this in SQL Server, this is the output from step 1, and this is the output from the temporary data set. So you're actually not going to notice a difference in the output, but rather it just tells SQL that this is temporary for the pivot table. So for step 3, you're going to apply the pivot operator. Here we have the pivot operator circled in red, and then you're going to put the driver charges because that's what you want to fill in the rows. You're also going to want not only the driver charge, but the average driver charge. So you're going to use this aggregate function and enclose it in parentheses. Next, you're going to list the driver names with the driver names because these are the columns the category of columns you're going to want. The in is then followed by Bill, Carol, Sal, and Willie because these are the driver names that fall under this driver name category. You're going to enclose it and add as pivot table with the semicolon. And when you go to run this over in SQL, you're actually going to combine it or execute it with the code that you wrote in step 2. So as I go to execute this will now give me my pivot table. So as you can see from how it's been denoted before, Bill, Carol, Sal, and Willie are no longer rows, but they're now columns with their respective average driver charges. So as I mentioned in a previous slide, you can use more than two categories in a pivot. What I just showed you in my demonstration used two categories, but now we can add a third category to see what it would look like. So in this case, what we would do is if we want to also compare driver ID alongside driver name and driver charge, we would drop that into the code that we made for step 2. So if I go over to the code for step 2, before it wasn't here, but we would add driver ID after driver charge with a parenthesis, and we would do nothing. We would not add it into the pivot statement. We would just leave it in step 2. And now when we execute it, we can see that our table looks slightly different because now we have driver ID along the left-hand side, which is then compared to the driver charge and correlated to the correct driver. So in conclusion, I really hope that that was able to teach a little bit about SQL pivots at both a beginner level, but also help for anyone that has had previous experience with SQL. And I know I'll find this really, really to my use because I use pivot tables all the time. So thank you again.